be resistance. The next battle will always be near. As long as you have everything, there will be those who have nothing to fear. And little by little, or maybe all at once, you will lose. Because our future is not yours to choose.
Welcome to Voices of Resistance. You are listening to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
The viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or the staff.
I'm Barbara Humphrey.
And I'm Albert Strickland.
Co-hosts of today's show. Voices of Resistance is a project of the Savannah Justice and Peace Collective. We give voice to resistors who have no voice in mainstream media and present a wide range of issues that affect us all.
But there will always be resistance. The next battle will always be near. As long as you have everything, there will be those who have nothing to fear. And little by little, or maybe all at once, you will lose. Because our future is not yours to choose.
Welcome to Voices of Resistance. I'm Barbara.
I'm Albert.
I'm
having trouble.
Albert having trouble. Well,
he's got his headphones wrapped around in his chair.
Interesting issue for a program where we're going to talk about women and discovering their power, understanding what they have, and tapping into it to use it when they need to. Introducing women to the power they possess, inspiring them to use their power, preferably for good. So we start out with a quote from a woman named Lucy Wollstonecraft, who was a writer, philosopher, women's rights activist, married to William Godwin and mother of Mary Shelley. Remind me, Albert, who William Godwin is?
William Godwin was an anarchist from that time period, a very well-known writer, and she was a mother of Mary Shelley, as you said, who was the author of a very famous book called Frankenstein.
Whose monster had no name.
Whose monster had no name, which we learned the other... I knew anyway.
Which we learned, yes. I learned. And I think this is a good quote to start the show. Lucy said, "I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves." So this is not a sort of battle of the sexes, who's got more power than who. It's for women to discover the power they have and to use it.
Right.
So women
something
do...
that's been denied throughout the ages, especially in Western culture.
That's right.
Others too, but especially in the Western culture.
That's right. I mean, as we did the research for the show, we discovered that women do have the power, not just to move men and move themselves, but also to resist and make changes to a system, overthrow systems. They have that power. And very often in a patriarchal society such as ours, women are robbed of their power or feel they're robbed of their power. But as we will talk about, so many women figured out how to take their power back and use it.
And in the patriarchy, women not only lose their power, they become slaves, children.
Possessions.
They become, possessions, like the horse in the barn.
Right. They have they were not able to own any property. They had no inheritance rights. And in fact, the quote, "a man's home is his castle," was a typical statement about the way things were.
Yeah.
And there is a basis for that under British common law. Women, when they married, became what's called femme covert, dead in the eyes of the legal system and unable to own anything separately from their husbands, and again, having no inheritance rights. Women became dependents and treated like underage children.
So when did that change?
Well, yeah, when did it change? Well, would you like to read this quote from a professor about the situation? He gives a great example.
Yeah, actually, this was quite good. He said, "As I tell my students, imagine you're a woman on the Illinois prairie, the only child of a very prosperous farmer. your parents die, and you inherit the family homestead. You marry, raise crops, and rear several children. But if your husband has a mind to sell the farm and travel west, you cannot stop the sale, and up on the buckboard you go. However, if you grew up near Albuquerque, your husband could not sell the property you had brought to the marriage, thus giving you significant leverage in household decisions, so you might not end up on that buckboard after all. And that just denotes the difference between the freedom of the West, which didn't have all the laws and conventions yet that the East did, and the woman in
right,
the
and Spanish law and indigenous
right.
indigenous law that would not have allowed a husband to sell joint property or sell property that came into the marriage from the woman.
I once read in a book that the women owned everything in this village. The teepee, this was on the Western, it was in a book, but it was still good. They owned the teepee, totally. It was theirs. And the divorce system was very simple. You came home, you found your things outside the teepee, that was it. You were over,
out.
you were gone. No more in that
That's
household.
right. No
You had to find
lawyers'
somewhere else
fees.
to-
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
I kind of like that system.
Yeah. And we're going to start with a little story that comes to us from ancient Greece. There was a play by Aristophanes called Lysistrata, and it's a comedy, and it's a comic account of a woman's extraordinary mission to end the Peloponnesian War, which was a war that apparently went on for a very long time. We didn't look up how many years, but from everything we read about it, it sounded like quite a long war.
And you can imagine now, when the men leave to go off to war, they plant the crops, they go off to fight each other. Who do they leave to do all the work, to raise the kids, to milk the cows, to do everything that needs to be done to maintain society? The women with the children. And they go off and kill each other and have all this
That's
fun
right.
and drinking.
And then when they come home, what do they expect?
That's right. They expect
That's
the
right.
wife there with the rose between her teeth, everything
That's right.
perfect,
That's
dinner on
right.
the table, and everything is good.
That's right.
And then they spend the winter and they
Yeah.
leave next time with more
Right.
children.
More.
And the women
More
got
killing.
tired of this after
That's
a
right.
while and said, I'm not putting up with this.
So this play was about a woman named Lysistrata who persuades the women of Greece to withhold sexual privileges from their husbands and lovers as a means to force the men to negotiate peace to end the interminable Peloponnesian War. Now, at this time, I'm sure women, like women throughout the centuries, didn't realize they had any power at all. But imagine that. And, you know, I grew up knowing about this play, and perhaps it was because I grew up during the civil rights and the anti-war times when this was a play that was talked about. Hey, women, you really want this war to end? Read this play. Think about the power that women have. And I think it would be good for all women to think about the power that they have.
The irony is, though, in this comic play in ancient Greece, women couldn't even play the part
That's
of
right.
the women actors, the women roles.
That's right.
Men had to play those parts
That's right.
in their stead.
Exactly
so, yeah.
right.
Talk
So-
about no power.
Yeah. So if we have a drama company here that might like to put the play on, hey, let me know, please.
I'd come watch that.
Yeah.
You could modernize it, you know.
Yeah.
Oh,
I'd even
I
start
don't have
it.
time for that.
We've got so many wars to choose from right now, you know.
That's
it's not
true.
just the Peloponnesian. We've got a bunch of them going on.
Right. And we're talking 400 BC.
Right.
So this
We're
is
talking almost
2,500 years ago. Right. And really from that period forward, even though most of the societies that we're familiar with, not all of them, but most of them, were patriarchal, but there were women who stood up. A lot of these women got lost. They didn't make it to the history books. Nobody really knows much about them. And some of us, in a very cynical way, could say that was by intent, because heaven forbid women learn about these other women who have power and exercised it.
There were very powerful very powerful women admirals. One of the Chinese admirals was a
Yes.
woman. She commanded 300 ships and controlled the China Sea. There were pirates, women pirates.
There was an empress actually in
There were
China at one
empress.
point. Yeah.
Yes.
Now,
And there
Empress
were-
does take on just a little bit.
Yeah, and they were the
different-
everyday
I mean,
people. They were the everyday people who found a place to have power.
Do you remember in ancient Egypt, Hatshepsut?
Oh, I remember it like it was yesterday.
Yeah, I was there, so I ought to know, you know. She wanted to be pharaoh. She had a brother, and he died of some sort of liver ailment. Of course, when they found his mummy, every bone in his body was broken, but it was a strange liver ailment. And she went around Egypt because women could not be pharaohs. Having them have his name taken off and hers put in its place was still the male figure. So she became the pharaoh.
I've not heard of that.
Yeah. So as we move to the USA in the pre- and the Revolutionary War period, for the most part, women played very traditional roles. They kept the home and hearth and did the women's work, while the men were out dumping the tea in the harbor and taking midnight rides and doing all the other things they did to writing the Declaration of Independence, doing all those things.
So what do you think these women did while these Minutemen and all were off doing these wars? And what did they do as far as businesses, the family businesses, keeping the houses and the children?
Well, I went to Williamsburg, Virginia once, and it looked like they were doing a lot of sewing and making food things and tending to general house things. That seems also like the cultural bias for a pretty long time.
But in fact, there were women during this pre-revolutionary and revolutionary period who were fundraising for the war effort, were bringing supplies to the battle lines, to the troops. They were working in the military camps. They were tending to the wounded soldiers. They were making the homespun cloth, making bullets and blankets, spying for the colonies, delivering water during the battles, and occasionally stepping in for the men on the battlefield, such as Molly Pitcher.
Right. Dang, if they had that at Williamsburg, maybe they'd be doing better business right now.
Would be,
Perhaps they
but
would.
Molly Pitcher was the one who rammed the cannons for them so that they could fill them up.
Yeah.
And she picked up muskets and fight,
But in addition, they were tending to home, farm, and business.
Yeah, the
as
women
the
who
men
didn't
went off to fight.
follow the camps, you have a business, you go off and leave it. Who do you think's going to take care of it while you're gone? It's not just sit there. If you've got a store or a dock, whatever you've got, it's got to be maintained. Who does that?
That's right. And there was a group called Daughters of Liberty, and they were at the forefront of, one of the ways that the colonists opposed the British was to boycott their goods, a strategy that continues to today. And Daughters of Liberty were at the forefront of the boycott effort. They spearheaded domestic production so that they could replace what they were boycotting in the British goods to have here in the colonies. And they did an interesting thing. They had public demonstrations where they sat and spun cloth. So they were very visible in what they did. And although they were barred from serving in the military and did primarily women's work, but they did it in support of the war, and they did it in skirts, not pants. They did it in support of the war effort, and some of it did move beyond women's work.
Well, there was the one. There were a lot of women who actually did try to join the military, dressed as men, acted as men. And we read the story where one of them actually was wounded in battle. But she couldn't let the doctor examine her to find how bad the wound was, because he would have discovered that she wasn't a man.
That's right.
And that wouldn't have been good for her at the time, so she wouldn't let him even tend to her.
So did she die?
No, actually
she did not die.
It was a minor thing.
No, she did herself. She extracted the bullet
that's right.
herself
And
and sewed herself
God.
up.
I remember that, yeah.
That sounds just
pretty amazing,
awful.
isn't it? Yeah. So most of this work of women went unrecognized, unheralded, and is pretty much unknown today. You're not going to open a typical history book and find that. And after the Revolutionary War, as the colonists moved westward, women followed their men. They had no choice, as we heard from that quote from that professor. They got on the buckboard and went. But they did discover that west, life was a little freer for them. First of all, they were the indigenous and Spanish, the first inhabitants of the western area. Under Spanish rule, women had property rights, and certainly the indigenous society was matriarchal. Not in opposition to patriarchy, but women played very important roles and were mostly, for the most part, equal to men in that society.
Mm-hmm. Different roles, but equal in voice. They
That's
could
right.
attend the
That's
many
right.
councils and do this sort of
So the white settlers did bring their Anglo-based laws, their patriarchy out west, but it was exercised differently.
thing. Yeah, and that's also the point. They didn't encounter an established Western system, so they're in the middle of nowhere. They kind of made
That's
up their own
frontier
rules.
land. You get to kind of do it your own way a bit.
That's right. So when it came up to court or women's rights, who's going to...
That's right. And shockingly, I mean, some of the Western territories, such as Wyoming, passed amazing laws giving women rights to vote, equal pay as men, as teachers, and created more liberal divorce laws. In fact, I can remember learning that Wyoming was actually the first state to give women the right to vote, and I was shocked. I never thought of Wyoming as such an incredibly liberal place, but...
Now, that was back when they were very independent.
Yes.
The West, they ruled, and
Yeah. And women were, at least upper-class women who could afford to, were also able to travel. They were able to own land and exercise control over their children. Imagine that concept. Wow.
Still can't do that very well.
I know. Nobody can control the children.
That's right.
That's right. But unfortunately, the Asian and indigenous women did not experience these freedoms. We were talking about white, upper-class women who had money. And one of the women who I'm sure most of us have heard of, Annie Oakley. And so we did a little research into her, and she worked as a sharpshooter in order to save the family farm while taking care of hearth and home.
They said that she first shot at 8 years old. At 15, she was winning shooting events. That meant money. The family was poor, losing their farm. She shot enough marksmanship events to make enough money to actually save the farm from being sold. It's kind of an old story. Son goes off and saves the family farm. In this case, the daughter goes off and saves the family
It's a
farm.
Disney movie waiting to happen.
It is.
I learned about that from a book of Daredevils when I was younger. It was like, it's this exciting book of Daredevils, it was called, or something like that. And Annie Oakley there's a whole chapter on her, and which I thought was pretty neat because it talked about how risky some of the things she would do, because she would shoot at live, like targets off of live people that could very well kill them and possibly get her in lots of trouble. And she didn't. I don't think she ever shot anybody. She would shoot cigarettes out of people's mouths.
The interesting thing is her husband trusted her enough that he was the one who actually stood more times than not with a cigarette in his mouth for her to shoot off. Now, that you don't have an argument before you go out.
No, you don't. You don't.
Whoops. But it does show that
Sorry,
the point was that women were believed not to be able to do these things, or not to be able to do the same things men did. Men were special. Women were just helpmakes.
Well, women were subservient to men for the most part, and when you're in a subservient position, you are focused more on your powerlessness than your power. You don't feel like you have any power, and often you're very fearful of using it, fearful of retribution. But there were women who understood that they did have some power, and often they exercised it for survival of their family. Because that nurturing, that's a lot of what women do, and they did it. They had the power and they took it. So pre and post Civil War, again, in our society, women mostly tended to hearth and home and did women's work, but there were a number of women, some of whom we know from our history books, who did extraordinary things at that time, such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, Harriet Tubman. We did a little research on Sojourner Truth, who's somebody who's a little less well known, although many people I'm sure have heard of her. She was born into slavery in New York 1 year before it was made illegal, but escaped to freedom 1 year before New York abolished slavery.
Right. A year before, she was, it was 1826, I think, when she escaped with her children, and it was made illegal in 1827. And so she just barely escaped.
Yes, she barely escaped.
It was made illegal, but she became a very, very powerful orator, though, throughout the country. She was definitely abolitionist, which certainly was understandable, and she was very powerful in the words she used. She churned a lot of people impressed a lot of people that this was an issue. Let's start talking about it.
After the war, she advocated for freed people during Reconstruction.
It's not free people. She advocated freed
people. Absolutely.
Give them better lives than what they were getting.
Yes, she actually advocated also for land for them, the freed people, she called them.
Right, the freed people.
Right.
And then, one of the things which we found kind of interesting is that she She was a powerful orator, and at one point she proclaimed from a segregated streetcar in Washington, D.C.,
Right.
"It is hard for the old slaveholding spirit to die, but die it must."
And in most of the world, it's still alive. Or in some of the world, it's still alive. In most of the world, it did die, hopefully.
Yes.
Oh, there's still a lot of the spirit
It's still
around.
alive.
Yeah.
And actually, slavery is, too. So it's not just... in
It's
fact,
right.
we're seeing a resurgence of it now in the Middle East and some of the countries that we have liberated.
Yeah.
Finding slavery coming back
That's right.
to vogue.
That's right. And we know that during and following the war, particularly the women in the South kept the South alive. I mean, there was such a large number of people who were killed and wounded, men who were killed and wounded.
Think about it for a moment. No matter which side, soldier goes off to war.
Right.
That leaves, and this is what we said earlier, it leaves a vacuum that has to be filled. And there are no men to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So who has to plow that field? Who has to fill in, bringing in the crops, and still do all the other things that she did before?
That's in the you named the show Bread and Roses, and that's in
Yeah.
the song. Actually, they
It
mentioned
is.
that every son that has to go off is still a mother's son. Like,
Yes.
and it
Right.
yeah.
Our
And
men
we
are our
mother them
children.
still.
Yeah.
We mother them still. And I say particularly the South because in the North, where there were more resources, there were hospitals, there was the women in the South, in addition to doing their jobs and running the businesses, running the farms while the men were gone, some who never returned, as the men were returning from the battlefields in the South, dragging themselves barely clothed, barely wearing shoes, women would take them in along the way and nurture them, try to help them heal.
And there was a book not long ago called Cold Mountain about that exact thing. The soldier going off, he
Right.
was wounded, he wanted to get back home, and it was about his journey home. In fact, there was a movie made of it, Cold Mountain. I read the book. The book was tremendous.
Yeah,
I saw the movie. It wasn't so hot.
wasn't
but
so tremendous, which
It
is
was with Nicole
usually the
Kidman,
case.
but it was still, the story was
Mhm.
phenomenal because all
Mhm.
he wanted to do was get home.
Right.
Everything, but get home to what at that point in time? No matter what war,
right.
there's always devastation, and there's sometimes nothing to come back to.
That's right.
That was
So you
a
had this
bad time
great-
afterwards.
Yeah, so you had this great migration of Southerners with coming home to nothing, who moved west.
That's right. That's right. And then, of course, we know following the Civil War, it wasn't too many years before the Industrial Revolution came along. It started in England, one of Albert's favorite periods in the U.S. Sometimes we call them a Luddite, but we're not going to talk about the Luddites today.
Does
and-
anyone know what a Luddite is really anymore? Yeah,
Yeah, I know. Probably
I'm a
not.
Luddite.
So,
Yeah, I'm just thinking technology's not your friend. So.
that's right.
He said on the radio.
And
I did
many,
say it.
and many, that's right.
Good point.
That's right. Yes, as we struggle to start our computers and get them to work right, technology is not always your friend. So the Industrial Revolution was a particularly challenging time for many women, poor women and immigrant women who just came to this country with barely the clothes on their back, who, as the industries were growing in the North in particular, but also in the South, as there was a greater demand for cotton, women had to go to work, and they often worked more than 80 hours a day. In addition,
A week.
I'm sorry, 80
Okay, I
hours
was
a
gonna
week.
say, wait a minute,
That's
now,
right.
things change.
You know my time
Technology's
challenge.
not my friend,
You
but
know
I-
my time challenge. 80 hours a week, and in addition to working and the children working, they also had to take care of the home. They also
Right.
had their duties at home that they had to deal with.
Well, I found that many times, even today, when a woman has to work to support a family, it's still expected by many men that she do the cleaning, she do the cooking, she does everything. At least that's my experience growing up.
That was mine.
You know?
There's definitely still people that think like that.
Yeah, and I'm not. That's a woman's work. That's a woman's job.
Right.
You know.
Right. That's right. So I am so elated to see that an awful lot of that is changing, but it certainly was alive and well during my earlier
Yeah, it's
years.
not changing fast enough.
No, not
That's
fast
true.
enough at all.
So this was a time where the pressures against the working class were mounting more than ever before, and as people that were already suffering on the short end of the stick for our class-based society, women were really struggling a lot here.
Well, in addition to, again, in addition to working 80 plus hours a week, they had to come home and take care of their domestic duties.
Right.
And they weren't exactly getting well paid, and the factory conditions were extremely dangerous. And then in the rural areas, poor rural women eked out subsistence living from the earth or took in work, washing clothes, watching children, the kinds of women's work, but doing it for money to keep their families going, and also did the work for their families.
And my grandmother grew up in rural Georgia, and she had to take in washing for the people in the White House on the Hill, and she had to do cleaning, she had to do sewing, just to survive. And
Right.
that's also, she had to make the biscuits and and she'd get up in the morning before my grandfather did to go out in the fields. It was her job to get up and make sure all the fireplaces had the fire going before he would get up. So
Yeah, what a life. So as the union movement grew, women played two roles. They supported their men in their unionizing efforts, in their strikes, and they also supported themselves, striking for their better working conditions, better pay. The early unions did not admit women, but we know of one union that did.
yeah, there was only one. The Knights of Labor and all these others, the AFL, they never would allow women or minority people. They would never allow them. So only this one union, and which one was that?
So this is the IWW, which actually is a little before that too, because we had so Lucy Parsons was one of the founders of the IWW,
Right.
But she actually got her start working on this stuff a bit before. We talked about the Haymarket affair before. Her husband was one of the people that was executed by the state wrongfully for a crime that he did not commit, and this inspired her a lot. I mean, she was already they were the ultimate revolutionary power couple in doing a lot of really amazing activist organizing. But when this happened, she went hard to cover the opponents of our time. She never stopped going, really organizing, and was claimed to be by Chicago police more dangerous than 1,000 rioters. That event, which inspired her, the death of her husband, also inspired Emma Goldman a lot. She had come to the U.S. not too long before that and was doing some trying to do some organizing work. But when the Haymarket martyrs were killed, it really inspired her in the circles that she was in to start growing a movement and making a large, powerful anarchist labor movement. And they did a lot.
They actually did. In fact, that when someone can say of you, whether you're male or female, that this person is more powerful than 1,000 rioters,
Right.
that says a lot. That woman found strength, you see.
That absolutely says a lot. And I am going to exercise my authority right
here we
now
go.
to ask these men to hold off for a minute in this great conversation while I identify our station and our show. So you're listening to Voices of Resistance on WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. All right. Well, we seem to be having some difficulty with our sponsors today.
I told you, technology is not your
So,
friend.
in exchange for not being able to hear sponsor announcements, I will simply say that WRUU just had an incredibly effective fund pledge drive, and raised an amazing amount of money from a very generous community. There are obviously so many people in this community who recognize the value of community radio, non-commercial community radio, as a place where you can hear programming that you would never hear on commercial radio, even to some extent programming you would not hear on public radio. And even though the fund drive has officially ended, you can still give. There's
Please.
still the opportunity. Go to wruu.org and make a end of year gift.
It's enough to make it for a while,
Right.
but it's not enough to make the station grow with some of the equipment the station
That's right.
needs, vital
That's right.
equipment that needs to help expand. And,
Right.
it's just we need more.
Absolutely. We need more.
More.
So there were actually 2 events, labor-related events.
One other thing.
Oh.
Lucy Parsons, he brought up a good point,
Okay.
Phoenix did, about Lucy Parsons, that you didn't say before.
We were just also talking about one really interesting thing about Lucy Parsons was that unlike a lot of these folks we're talking about, she was obviously not everyone, but a lot of the ones. She's another woman of color here. She was born into slavery and was a mix of Native American, Black, and Mexican. She was originally Lucy Gonzalez, and she took that like very, very far with her. Like, I mean, she expanded the bounds of where so many people were able to accomplish with that, and it was. I don't really have the words for it. She's very impressive as a person, and she said this quote, and she said, "Never be deceived that the rich will permit you to vote away their wealth," which I think is still very true today.
Is.
How true that is. How absolutely true that is. So the 2 events that are labor related that really show the power and the strength of women. One was called the bread and was actually it was a strike by miners in Wales, and we had the opportunity to see a movie called Pride, which focused on a very interesting alliance between gay and lesbian people in London and these miners in Wales and the relationships. So first, women played a very valuable role because the miners did not exactly welcome these gay and lesbians from London into their ranks, and it was the women who pretty much said to the men, "These people are here to help you. Put it aside and figure out how to make this work." And then you also saw them. I mean, they were amazing. They put the people up in their houses. They cooked. They did whatever they needed to do, because it's not like there was a big strike fund that would take care of these miners while they were on strike. And it was an amazing way to see women come together and how powerful they were in that action. The other one is the Lawrence Mass textile strike of 1912. And this did have the involvement of the Wobblies. I believe it was Bill Hayward and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn who got involved. And this was an amazingly powerful strike, mostly women, 200,000 workers in nearly every mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts went out on strike. In fact, the strike was so widespread and lasted so long that they actually sent the children to New York City, other big cities around, so the children could eat and be able to have clothes on their back while the women were striking, because there was no money coming in. And they used this as an interesting PR tactic to get people to support the strikers. They did also some very clever things. Created a moving picket line to get around the law that made it illegal for strikers to gather outside the business that they were striking. They brought out information that shocked the country about just how dangerous the workers. I mean, textile factories, they would typically lock the doors when the people came in to work so they wouldn't go out on a break, heaven forbid, see the sunshine, smell the fresh air. And if a fire started in a textile factory, They died.
Which did happen.
Which absolutely did happen.
It still happens. Remember the
And it still
Bangladesh
happens.
fires not
That's
too long
right.
ago.
That's right. And this was called the Bread and Roses Strike. And at the victory party after the strike settlement, they actually sang the Internationale.
In many different
In
languages.
many different languages, very,
because
very
actually,
powerful.
these women who were working these mills, they were extremely poor. They were immigrant usually, and they had nothing else. So they had to actually at the mercy of these rich mill owners. So while they're going off on their cruises on the Titanic, which they did, people are actually starving back in their mills and losing limbs. Children even went to work as old as young as 5, 6 years old, working in these mills around this dangerous equipment. This is the Industrial Revolution at its finest, sort of thing. No protection, no safety equipment, nothing.
That's right.
Pure capitalism.
In
Pure
fact,
capitalism. Money,
we're
money,
going
money, money,
where
money.
we will be talking about Helen Keller, who was an amazing woman who got involved not only in the labor movement but also women's rights and anti-war, who got involved in the labor movement because she was hired to investigate working conditions for blind people in the factories and discovered the most horrendous working conditions there.
Now, for those of you who don't know, Helen Keller was blind, but she was also deaf.
That's
and
right.
yet, she got a college degree.
Yes, she did.
And she did tremendous work.
Amazing
Now,
work.
here's most of us, not blind, not deaf, great education, and we do very little.
She helped fund the ACLU, right?
She did.
Yes.
Yeah, she helped found it,
Yes.
the ACLU.
She was a socialist who used to defend the IWW and
Absolutely. She was an
Yeah,
anarchist.
she was an incredibly
socialist,
amazing person. So typically in the history books, we only learn about, blind and deaf Helen Keller who learned how to read. We don't
Or how
we don't
to
get
make
the
things
details.
with her hands.
That's right.
She did so much
She could
more.
make things with her hands.
In fact, what did you hear of Helen Keller when you were in school?
really distasteful jokes. That's
Okay.
most of it.
All
That's
right.
sad, isn't it?
No, it's really horrible, actually. But then that's the thing though. When I later learned actually about who she was, it's really it's stupefying because she is such a pivotal figure in our history and did so much despite her disadvantages. Like the fact that she was involved with starting the ACLU, like nobody knows that. Everybody knows the ACLU is a thing. And people have heard Helen Keller jokes, but nobody knows,
Right.
she's actually really important and has done a lot of amazing things for people.
But the amazing thing to me is that these women are unrecognized, and yet without them, nothing would have changed. They have far more power, far more input into these movements.
Right.
But it was silenced, written out of history. Their names are not known. What they did are rarely known. There are a few,
That's
but
right.
not
There
very
are a
many.
few, but not many.
And what you do learn about them is, like you said, it's almost nothing, and if anything else, it's laughable.
Right.
Because we still are under the impression that women are somehow less than men.
That's right. That's right. Another important woman back at the time involved in the labor movement was Mother Jones.
Oh, one of my
Fascinating figure. She founded the Social Democratic Party, helped establish the IWW, and was considered one of the most dangerous women in America. What an achievement to be on that list. She
Yeah.
actually was imprisoned, but pardoned thanks to the amazing support she had from people.
That's
To
yeah.
and there were hundreds and hundreds and probably thousands of other women who were active at that time, again, doing their women's work, but also stepping out, seizing their power and using it.
Now, Mother Jones was, because she extensively traveled, and she did have that mother image, everybody she met, but she pushed them to stand up, to do what needed to be done, no matter the cost, stand up. And she didn't just push them to do it, she did it herself tirelessly. As I said, they founded the ACLU, but she went far beyond that. And they have these, this magazine is published, a booklet. It's still being published, this magazine. It's called Mother Jones Mother Jones, and you should read it, get it up, pick it up, read it.
Yeah.
She was phenomenal, she is phenomenal, and she will be as long as we remember who she is.
Right. Now, it
In
won't.
fact, all these women.
That's right. It won't surprise anybody that the suffrage movement in the United States was women played a very amazing part in that. But some of the women we're going to talk about and some of the situations may not be well known. As we mentioned earlier, there was British common law, femme cavat, that women were dependent, treated like underage children, didn't have the right to vote, had no property rights, had no inheritance rights.
And even if the husband died, she couldn't. Didn't
That's
get
right. She
control
did
of the
not
children.
inherit.
It went
That's
through,
right.
Yeah.
So women certainly had an incredible uphill battle. Voting, yes, was important, but so many of these other issues were so much more important. So by the mid-1800s, women were already starting to advocate for their rights, including the right to vote. Now, there was one woman, Lucretia Mott, that may be very familiar to everybody. Lucretia Mott was from upstate New York, and she and her husband got to spend some time on the Seneca Nation. And while at on the Seneca Nation, she did experience a matriarchal society. And she took what she learned on the Seneca Nation to the 1848 Seneca Falls Rights Convention. In particular, she realized the powerful role that Indigenous women played. They nominated the chiefs. That nomination of chiefs rested with women. The descent ran through the female line, and the division of power between the sexes was nearly equal. I mean, it must have shocked her when she saw the way the society operated and what could be.
Well, in a patriarchal society, men rule. That's
Yes.
it, and women have no rights. In a matriarchy, it's the opposite of that. Actually, women are equal. They have equal voice, equal footing. They are able to make decisions, but they don't rule men. It's a relationship that we can't even fathom. When we think of matriarchies, we think of women ruling instead of men, and the men are subjugated.
You should think of mothers. That's what matriarchy means, and it
Right.
should be at least technically, literally means a motherly relationship, which
Yeah.
Right.
isn't necessarily supposed to be a bad thing.
I remember the
Shouldn't
story.
be.
I remember the story of the Oka, call it rebellion, for the Mohawk in Canada. They had decided this country club wanted this burial ground on Indian land
Right, a golf course.
to build a golf,
Yeah.
to extend
Right,
their
to
golf
extend,
course.
Expand.
Well, actually now the native were not too happy about this in those days, so they resisted. They set up roadblocks and that sort of thing, and when the government started sending forces in, the women would go down and talk to the soldiers or talk to the people that came up to plead their case to let them have this golf course. And they interviewed a Mohawk warrior after that, and they asked him, well, why is this? The women are down there. Why aren't you down there? He said, the women know what they're doing. They take care of everything. We don't do anything until they tell us to. When they tell us to go in, then we go in and do our job. So that's the matriarchal
That's
point.
right.
The
Just
difference
imagine
between
Lucretia Mott's learning curve
Yeah.
and what she brought to that Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. And out of that convention came this 1848 Declaration of Sentiments. It demanded equal social status and legal rights for women, including the right to vote. So we can understand very clearly where that came from. And in addition to some of the women that we always hear about, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, there were other women who played an incredible role in the suffragist movement who may be a little more silent, including a group called the Silent Sentinels.
Yeah, when we were at Occupy, we showed a movie at the Central Bean called Iron-Jawed Angels, and it was an HBO film, and it actually was about the Silent Sentinels. It was about the women who were out to get the right to vote. And the most amazing part of the movie was these Silent Sentinels, these women standing there, holding in front of the White House now, holding these large banners written with all their sayings and their demands, like we would do now with our posters, and they just stood there. But this was the building up
Silent.
for a war. So women were beaten, police harassed them daily, men would walk up, slap them, or spit on them and tell them to get home. They had no right to do this. So their protests, they went through a lot. Finally, they were arrested. They were put in prison. They were tortured in prison. They went on strike. They were force-fed. You've heard of the force feeding today. This happened back in the early 1900s, 1913, 1912, 14. So it was an amazing time. They stood all of this, and the president couldn't do anything about it, really.
Right.
Six would leave, 6 more would come.
That's right.
6 more would come. They just kept doing this rotation.
And one of the women who was part of the Silent Sentinels was Dorothy Day, who is a woman that I have always had a great deal of respect for. She helped found the Catholic Worker Movement in 1933. And the purpose of the Catholic Worker Movement was to live in accordance with the justice and charity of Jesus Christ. One of the guiding principles is hospitality towards those on the margin of society, and it's based on the principles of communitarianism and personalism. And I have personally experienced Catholic worker houses. We have a Catholic worker house. We had Catholic worker houses where I was from up north. One was a hospice for people with HIV/AIDS. One was a jail ministry program that provided bail money and kind of a phone relay service so people in jail could make phone calls without paying exorbitant rates. And it was people who were activists. Father Berrigan was a Catholic worker. So many people in history who did amazing things came from this Catholic worker movement.
Which is strange, given that most of the ills put on women have
That's
been
right.
solidified by
That's
this
right.
Judeo-Christian concepts.
That's right.
But it says emphatically, women are supposed to be subservient to the husband. You're supposed to submit to his every whim and fancy.
Mm-hmm.
And also, even in the wedding ceremony, if you remember, it was never, I now pronounce you man and woman.
It's man.
It was always man
and wife.
Like this was
That's right.
the
Man
prize.
still retains his identity, but the woman becomes a wife.
That's right.
Yeah, that's right.
They've changed that now.
I had never thought of that before.
It's true, though.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I see it now.
Now they're saying
Now it's
husband
really
and wife.
obvious.
Yeah.
Now they're saying husband and wife. Many of them they realized what was going. But see, the whole thing is that was subconscious. A lot of it.
Right.
So
Right. And,
like I said, you never thought of it.
not surprisingly, there were women in history, many of whom were invisible, some were scorned, who played a very powerful role in peace and anti-war movements. And I feel that as a woman, women have a particularly a significant role. Women bring life into this world. And as a woman, I can say quite honestly, I did not bring my children into this world to become cannon fodder.
To make money for rich people.
And to make money for rich people.
By
But
dying or
whether they're
killing.
making money for rich people or not, to die at the other end of a cannon. That's not why I carried these children. That's not why I birthed them. And that alone makes me feel that it's a perfect fit for women in a peace movement. That this is not why we bring people into this world, and enough is enough. And we had some amazing women in the peace movement over the years.
Emma Goldman was one of them.
That's
I
right.
brought her
Yes.
up. She was arrested for protesting World War I very heavily.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we have Jeanette Rankin. And Jeanette Rankin was a fascinating person. Jeanette Rankin was from Montana. And she
There we go,
ran
that western state again.
that western state. So interesting enough, Montana has, or at least at the time, maybe is still the case, 2 members of the House of Representatives because they're small population. And instead of having congressional districts, both members run statewide. And she ran for one of those seats. And Montana's a pretty big state, pretty rural state, but she got around. She actually beat her male opponent by 7,500 votes, which shocked
That's
me because I
amazing,
wasn't
it was.
sure there were 7,500 people in Montana.
Is this an artifact from what y'all were talking about, how there was slightly more progressive cultures out west at the
It could
time?
have. I mean, it could have led to this. I don't know enough of who she was and what she was. I think from what little bit I read, it sounded like she came from a political family, and she may have been known in the state. I don't know.
But when people traveled to the West, they felt free again.
Yeah.
Because the constraints of the East,
That's right.
the mores,
and may not have felt so
the
threatened
different
by
dress
women.
styles, the social mores weren't there. So they could actually develop on their own a lot more free, independent.
Right.
Was
So
a big
Jeanette
thing, and that
Rankin
applied to women as well.
was the first woman to hold federal office. She was elected to Congress in 1916. And she was able to vote against the U.S. entry into World War I.
Which she did with great joy.
That's right, with great joy in 1917 when Woodrow Wilson made this impassioned speech for the country to join. Of course, she was only one of 50 people who voted no. The country did join and enter World War I.
Senseless.
She left Congress, and one of the things she did when she left Congress was buy some land in Bogart, Georgia, near Athens, a 68-acre farm.
And with no running water, and no electricity.
That's right. She was definitely a primitivist. And with colleagues from the University of Georgia, she helped found the Georgia Peace Society. We tried to figure out if that society is still alive. All I could find is archival records, but I was pretty impressed with that. She went back to Montana, ran again, and was elected again to Congress from Montana in 1940.
And
so she also got to vote against World War II. She was the only member of Congress to vote against World War II. In fact, after that vote, she had to hide in the telephone booth because people were so angry they were chasing her down the street. She had to hide in a telephone booth, call the Capitol Police to escort her to her office, to get to her office safely. So that's a great story. I mean, that was a woman who truly recognized the power she had and used it.
It was also one of them I want to get to is Rosa Luxemburg.
Yes,
because
absolutely.
she was very important in the peace movement. And the statement that she made is what I really want to say.
Yeah, this is a good one.
Yeah, that those who do not move do not notice their chains.
That's right.
And that's really important because most people now
Incredibly
are not
important.
moving.
That's right.
And the
That's
chains
right.
are tighter now than they've ever
That's
been
right.
and getting tighter
That's
every
right.
day.
Yeah. So more recently, we had some amazing women. Back in the 60s, we had Bernadette Dorn, who was considered a 1960s revolutionary who declared war on the U.S. government as a member of the Weather Underground.
That's right. The student for Democratic Society and their offshoot, the Weather Underground.
That's right. And then we have Jane Fonda, Hanoi Jane.
Now, I have a story about that.
Yes.
I was at Tasage Air Base in Japan whenever Jane Fonda, Michael Harrington, the socialist writer, and Judith, what was her name? Anyway, she came. They all three came on this peace move, and it was sponsored by the SDS of Japan called the Beiheiden. And I was at the gate that day, and they were all out there protesting. And so I, at this time, had become very anti-war. Had slipped a message to the Beiheiden on a piece of paper that I would like to meet with them. And lo and behold, I got this invitation to go downtown later, and there sat Jane Fonda, Michael Harrington,
Wow.
Judith Merrill. That was her name.
That's
science
exciting.
fiction writer, Pennsylvania.
That's exciting.
And I had lunch with them and about 10 other people in this little Japanese restaurant. So it was really a phenomenal time.
Right.
Would you consider that an important moment in your life towards activism?
Absolutely.
Going forward?
Absolutely.
That's really
the most
interesting. I didn't
important
know
was in
about that.
Vietnam, but this one certainly added to it because she spoke with such passion. She was not...
She was not grandstanding.
No,
she
not
had
at
lived
all.
in France.
She was concerned.
As many of the military people, the U.S. military resistors, were living in France. They had either deserted from the war or they refused to serve. And she got to meet and talk to them, and she realized so much of what we were all being fed, but in particularly the military people who had been drafted or chose to enlist, the lies they were told about why we were in Vietnam and what to expect when we were there. So as she heard that, she did more research and she realized there was not truth-telling, and she chose to go to Hanoi, not because she supported the North Vietnamese, not because she was a communist, but she wanted to learn the truth. That's right.
Yeah. But she got the title Hanoi Jane from that point. It still goes through
right.
today, and she's still ridiculed
Yeah.
by many people for it.
Yeah.
But to me, she is a hero.
That's right. And she actually reappeared again. She went to Standing Rock last year on Thanksgiving to help serve. And
she donated a lot.
And she donated a lot.
Yes, trying to help as much as she could.
That's right. And there are two women of more recent vintage, Medea Benjamin and Cindy Sheehan. Together they they formed Code Pink, which is an incredible organization. They do some amazing things, protests. They're very vocal. Cindy Sheehan, in particular, was the mother of a child who was killed in Iraq early on in the war.
Okay,
And they did an encampment in Crawford, Texas, at Bush's Ranch. And that was where Code Pink was founded.
She wanted the truth. That's all
That's
she
right.
wanted, and she knew she was not going to get it.
That's right. Two women who were just ordinary, everyday women, mothers, whatever, and they became pretty powerful. They found their power and they used it.
And then there's a person we've met many times, Colonel Ann Wright.
Yes, Colonel
who
Ann
is now
Wright,
a very activist
who,
against the war.
as soon as
She's a
war was
phenomenal
declared
person.
against Iraq, who she resigned her commission and she left the military. Absolutely.
There's also Angela Davis. We didn't bring her up, but
We haven't.
she,
This could be a three-part
she's
show.
so-
We
she's
are
so
really
good,
running out
though.
of time at this
Yeah.
point,
She-
right?
well, just real quick, she was allied with the Black Panther Party, and she has all her life advocated very strongly for prison abolition. That
That's
we
right.
used
That's
her
right.
research for part
That's
of our
right.
one of our
Reform.
shows before, actually.
That's right.
Right. And there's so many other people we're not going to
So
have
many
done.
other people.
Uh,
Do you
Sada
want to talk
Shakur,
about
for
quickly
instance.
Voltairine de Cleyre? And I would like to talk
Ah,
about
yes.
some of these less known women at the end of our list.
Now, where is that?
She
Oh, I got it.
is-
Okay, I got
okay.
it. Voltairine de Cleyre. She was an anarchist who actually advocated against capitalism, against state, against marriage, domination of religion over sexuality in women's lives, and she never she said, "I never expect them to give liberty," but the things never expect them to give liberty. No woman, we are not worth it until we take it. You have to take the liberty. This is what government is, has always been, the creator and defender of oppression and revenge. To hope that it can ever become anything else is the vainest of delusions. They tell you that anarchy, the dream of social order without government, is a wild fancy. The wildest dream that ever entered the heart of man is the dream that mankind can ever help itself through the appeal of law, or to come to any order that will not result in slavery where there is any excuse for a government.
Here, here.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. She was an amazing person. We read some of her quotes today.
Yeah.
And if somebody asked me who I might like to have dinner with, I think Voltairine might be one of those women. So before we end for the day, we still have
We've got another hour, right?
we
Dave Lake, Kate,
yeah,
just
2
gave
minutes
anything.
we have, and in that
2
I
minutes ago.
would like to just take a little bit of time to slowly say some names and urge you who are listening to just look them up, Google them, and see the powerful things that they did, stepping out of their traditional roles as women. In the area of medicine, we have Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman to graduate from a U.S. medical college.
In
In
1849.
1849, Dr. Linda Lobenstein, who was a doctor treating AIDS patients, trying to get the medical establishment to listen to her and to listen to what she was seeing. Emma Booker, who was quite radical in helping to found a school in a Sarasota grammar school that was educating black children at a time in the South in 1925 when there was really, people were not doing that. And just as an aside, it was the Emma Booker School, which was named after her in Sarasota, where George Bush was reading his story about a goat on 9/11.
Right.
So I feel sorry for Emma. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who started the hospice movement.
Maria Montessori is another educator.
Yes, Maria
That's true, we
Montessori.
didn't-
She started a
Absolutely.
very innovative education
Yes.
system worth looking
Yes.
into.
That's right.
And as we step forward into current times, I feel like we can celebrate our successes, but also look at our missed opportunities. We didn't have any opportunity to talk about the Women's March in Washington.
We were there, though.
We were there. Seeing to bring 1 million women together at one time was certainly a success, but was it also a missed opportunity? And with that, I think we can sign off. We're Voices of Resistance on WRUU LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We're Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. Tune in next week where we're going to talk about Puerto Rico, what it means to be a territory of the United States.
Thank you, everyone.